Imagine you are a woman, 60,000 years ago. You are somewhere in what will one day be called northern Iraq. The cold has been deepening for months. Food is scarce. The group you depend on for survival is already stretched thin. Every able body matters, and there is almost no margin for anything that slows you down. And you are pregnant. You have no hospital, no physician, not a single written word of medical knowledge to draw from. What you have is the people around you. And the question that determined whether you and your child lived or died was whether those people knew what to do. It turns out they did. And what they knew, how they learned it, and how far that knowledge traveled across tens of thousands of years is one of the most quietly astonishing stories in all of human history. It begins not with a discovery about pregnancy. It begins with a discovery about pain. In 2000, researchers reanalyzing skeletal remains from Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq found something that changed how scientists understood early human society. Among the Neanderthal bones were individuals who had survived catastrophic injuries, a crushed leg, a missing arm, severe cranial trauma, injuries that made independent survival completely impossible. These people could not hunt, could not travel without help, and yet the bones showed long-term healing. Months, possibly years. Someone carried them. Someone fed them. Someone stayed. In a world where survival was the only objective, some group of early humans had decided the vulnerable were worth the cost. That decision echoes forward across 60,000 years. Because once a community commits to protecting its most vulnerable members, it does not stop at the injured. It extends to the sick, to the elderly, and to pregnant women who in the ancient world faced a level of physical risk almost incomprehensible to imagine today. Ancient childbirth was genuinely dangerous. Hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor. Without intervention, any one of these could kill within hours. The communities that survived were the ones that built knowledge, that watched, remembered, and passed forward everything they had learned. And the depth of what they eventually learned will surprise you. The Ebers Papyrus is one of the oldest surviving medical documents on Earth. Written in Egypt around 1550 BCE, it preserves knowledge accumulated over far longer periods, passed through generations of practitioners before anyone thought to write it down. Inside this document are detailed protocols for pregnancy, fetal position assessment, herbal preparations to ease labor, specific interventions for hemorrhage, prolonged labor, and postpartum infection. Read those words again. Fetal position, hemorrhage management, postpartum care. These are not the concerns of a civilization guessing its way through medicine. These are the concerns of a civilization that had seen what goes wrong, understood why, and built systems to prevent it. Ancient Egypt had an entire professional class dedicated to birth. Their title translates as one who knows the mysteries of a woman. They trained under senior practitioners. They served in royal households and ordinary villages. They carried clinical knowledge sustained entirely by the oldest information network in human history. Women teaching women, generation after generation, in an unbroken line. But then researchers looked more closely at what these practitioners actually knew. And what they found quietly unsettled a lot of assumptions. One Egyptian diagnostic method, a pregnancy test using grain germination in urine, was independently tested in a 1963 laboratory study. It was accurate approximately 70% of the time, a working diagnostic test. 40 centuries old. Sit with that for a moment. Now consider this. The Egyptians did not separate their medicine from their cosmology. Birth was not simply a biological event. It was a threshold, a sacred crossing, where the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it became briefly, dangerously thin. Specific words were spoken at specific moments. Protective objects surrounded the mother. Symbols marked the walls. And here is what modern readers almost always misunderstand. The ritual and the medicine were not two different things. They were one thing. The same impulse, protect this woman, Bring this child safely through, expressed simultaneously in herbs and in words, in physical touch and in prayer. To separate them would have made no sense. The body and the spirit were not separate. The treatment addressed both because both were real. Inside that framework, they built something that worked. Now move east. Into Mesopotamia? Into ancient Babylon, where scribes preserved among legal codes and astronomical records something remarkable: detailed midwifery instructions pressed into clay. The tablets describe patron deities of childbirth and rituals calibrated to each stage of labor. And embedded within the ceremonial language, practical enough to read like a modern clinical note, a description of labor support techniques. Encourage the woman to move. Change her position frequently. Have other women apply firm, steady pressure to her lower back. Modern obstetrics spent the better part of a century placing women on their backs to labor. It was convenient for physicians. Research published in the late 20th century confirmed what any laboring woman could have told them. Upright positions, movement, and back pressure genuinely help. The Babylonians wrote this down 3,000 years earlier. The knowledge keeps moving westward, accumulating sophistication with every civilization that picks it up. In the 2nd century CE, the Greek physician Soranus of Ephesus wrote the most influential gynecological text of the ancient world. His description of the ideal midwife reads nothing like mythology. It reads like a job description: calm under pressure, free of superstition, strong hands, trimmed fingernails, educated enough to keep learning. And then Soranus adds something that stops modern readers cold. She must be compassionate, not as a personality preference, as a clinical requirement. Because Soranus had observed, without any understanding of cortisol or stress physiology, that frightened women labored harder and worse, that a woman who felt safe moved through birth more effectively than one who felt alone. He was not being sentimental. He was being precise. Emotional safety as documented medical strategy. 2,000 years ago. Meanwhile in Rome, ordinary women were leaving their own record of how seriously pregnancy was taken. Hundreds of small terracotta figurines, votives, have been recovered from temple shrine sites across Italy. Some show pregnant abdomens. Some show newborns. And some show internal pelvic anatomy with an accuracy that startled researchers. These were not made by physicians. They were made by women paying close, careful attention to what was happening inside their own bodies. Roman midwives left an even more direct record, named on funerary inscriptions the way a senator or merchant would be identified by his work. One inscription honors a midwife with exactly two qualities: great skill and great kindness, because whoever carved those words understood that skill alone was never going to be enough. Now here is where the story turns uncomfortable. In the 16th and 17th centuries, formal medical institutions across Europe began excluding women from birth practice. Midwifery was reframed as unscientific. Trained physicians moved into the space midwives had occupied for thousands of years. This was supposed to be progress. Maternal mortality in hospitals where these physicians practiced was, for an extended period, dramatically higher than in home births attended by traditional midwives. Ignaz Semmelweis identified the reason in 1847. Physicians were moving from cadaver dissection directly to deliveries without washing their hands. Midwives, who did not perform dissection, were not doing this. Here is the detail that makes this genuinely haunting. Ancient midwifery traditions across dozens of cultures included ritual purification before attending a birth, hand washing, cleansing of tools, careful preparation of the birth space. For centuries, historians cataloged these as superstition. They were infection control. Preserved inside ritual, because ritual was the technology available for storing knowledge before writing was widespread. The ceremony was not decoration around the medicine. The ceremony was the medicine, and when it was discarded as primitive, the protection it carried was discarded with it. Women died because of that dismissal. In ancient India, the Ayurvedic tradition had formalized prenatal care into a complete discipline called Garbhini Parikarya, organized across each stage of pregnancy. Nutritional guidance, sleep protocols, herbal preparations, and running through all of it, the same observation made in Greece, in Babylon, in Egypt, that maternal emotional state affected outcomes. That stress and fear were not separate from the physical experience of pregnancy. They were part of it. These traditions did not share this insight because they shared texts. They developed in isolation. But they were all watching the same thing: human pregnancy, human birth, human loss, and paying close enough attention to see the same truth. A practice called continuous labor support, a dedicated person present throughout labor, focused entirely on the mother's comfort and emotional state, was studied rigorously in recent decades. It reduces cesarean rates, reduces pain medication use, shortens labor, and improves outcomes for both mother and infant. It is now recommended by major obstetric organizations worldwide. The ancient world called this person a midwife, a neighbor, the woman who had done it before, the woman who stayed. We built clinical trials to prove what they already knew. Picture that woman again, 60,000 years ago. Cold, frightened, in a cave in what is now northern Iraq. No hospitals, no written knowledge, no institutions, but people who stayed, who carried knowledge in their hands and their memory, who watched and learned, and were determined that what they knew would not die with them. That knowledge moved. It crossed mountains and centuries, written into papyrus in Egypt, pressed into clay in Babylon, carved into stone in Rome, organized into formal medicine in India, carried by women who trained other women in an unbroken chain of accumulated human understanding. Some of it was wrong. Some was lost. Some was deliberately discarded by people who should have known better. But the core of it survived. The insistence that pregnancy deserves attention, preparation, skilled hands, community, and human presence that crossed every border, outlasted every empire, and refused to disappear. They built that understanding from nothing. From observation alone, from watching and caring, and refusing to accept that loss was inevitable. The woman in that cave, the Egyptian midwife who knew the mysteries, the Babylonian practitioner pressing instruction into clay, the Roman woman carrying a votive to the temple, asking simply for protection. Soranus writing that compassion is a clinical requirement. The midwife honored on her grave for skill and kindness, all part of the same story. The story of human beings deciding, again and again, that a woman at her most vulnerable deserves more than luck. She deserves knowledge, presence, someone who has done the work of understanding what she is facing, and who will not leave her to face it alone. They knew that before they had words for it. We are still, in our best moments, trying to live up to it.